Welcome to Creepypasta. Please like, share and subscribe. This will help us make more content for you. Thank you.
My dad is a reincarnated World War II pilot. When my dad was 2, in 1958, my grandparents were traveling home from a vacation in California, back to Arizona. It was night, and my dad started talking to my grandparents, but it wasn't exactly his voice. He started telling my grandparents that he was an American pilot over the Pacific in World War II. It really scared my grandma because he suddenly had a very adult vocabulary. So they asked him questions. My grandpa was a Korean War veteran. He gave them detailed accounts of the battle he was involved in, the plane he flew, the aircraft carrier he was on, all stuff that no 2-year-old would know. He told my grandparents he was shot down, but survived. He was killed by sharks, though, because the shark repellent given to them didn't work. My grandparents didn't talk about it for years, and my dad went back to being a normal 2-year-old. A few years later a report was released and confirmed that the shark repellent didn't work. My dad said when he was a kid, for as long as he could remember, he had dreams about fighting the Japanese over the Pacific. The dreams always ended with him crash landing and being eaten by sharks. He still had the dreams up until his early 20s. These dreams made my dad really interested in reading and learning more about World War II. He didn't remember telling my grandparents about being a pilot, and they didn't tell him about it until he was in his 30s. So now my dad is pretty convinced the dreams and the incident with my grandparents were memories of his past life. My dad is now in his 60s, and I asked him if he ever has those reoccurring dreams anymore. He said he does, but it's very rarely these days.
Comments. Interesting. My dad used to be a religion writer before he retired. A few years ago, he was writing a series about reincarnation. He interviewed a family who had a young son who used to have night terrors every night for the first few years of his life, dreaming of his World War II fighter jet being shot down by the Japanese flying over Hawaii, dying a violent death. The young boy was obsessed with model airplanes. He had many in his room and would break off the left propeller on all of them. He'd drawn hundreds of pictures of himself in a fighter jet with the left propeller going up in smoke over the ocean. His dad took him to the Air and Space Museum in DC, and the boy was able to eloquently identify the plane he used to fly and talk in detail about how the plane operated. The family is Christian, so the idea of the boy being reincarnated was not a welcomed concept. Over time, the parents listened to their son more and more talk about his war stories. He was apparently born in Philadelphia. He talked about his former family. He had a younger sister. He remembered very specific details about her and the family. They were actually able to reach out to the sister, who was in her 90s at the time, and talk to her. She had a "what is this, some kind of sick joke, don't insult my brother, he was a hero" kind of sentiment when he reached out initially. Then the boy went into detail about their family's history, particularly their father's battle with alcoholism, being carted away to the mental hospital. The sister apparently just sat in silence for a while before saying, "I've never told anyone that story in my entire life. There's no way you could possibly know that." From there on out, the boy and his older sister maintained somewhat of a relationship. But as the boy grew up and years passed, his memories faded, and now he's just a regular kid, just doing what regular kids do. I don't know if he has much memory of his past life any longer. There's so much more to the story. And reincarnation is definitely a skeptical idea for a lot of people in Western culture, understandably. This is all anecdotal at this point, so I can see why a lot of people wouldn't buy into the idea. I certainly don't understand it by a long shot, but reincarnation is totally fascinating to me. It's really interesting to hear that your dad had a similar experience.
I am a Christian. Don't believe in reincarnation. But I'm remembering the war I died in. I've never talked about this to anyone except my wife. For reference, I'm 29. Born in 1988. Ever since I was young, I felt like I was somehow attached to the Vietnam War. I was fascinated with anything and everything related to the Vietnam War. I was infatuated with the 50s, longed for what it must have been like to grow up in that time. As I've become more aware of this, I've noticed that not only do I feel attached to that time, I feel like I remember that time. I will be watching a Vietnam War documentary, and something will come across the screen that makes my brain sound alarm bells. It's like being smacked in the face with a memory. It has even gone so far as to make me emotional, even though I don't know why. It isn't a scene that would be particularly emotional, but for some reason I feel strong emotions. Anger, pain, sorrow, etc. I feel somehow tied to that era. I feel like I grew up in the 50s, and I fought in Vietnam, and possibly died there. I don't believe it, necessarily. I just wanted to put this out there in case anyone else had similar experiences, albeit with a different timeline. Please don't assume I am crazy. I feel embarrassed even typing this because I know it sounds ridiculous. Feel free to ask questions or just tell me I'm being silly. Thanks y'all. I didn't include this in the original post because I thought someone would just assume I was making all of this up. But here's yet another weird tidbit. When I was 7 years old I discovered what dog tags were. From that very moment, I demanded a set of dog tags to wear. I pestered my parents so much that my grandparents took me to the naval station in Alabama, just so I could get a set of dog tags. It was a 2.5-hour drive to get there. There's a battleship park there also that you can tour, so we made a day of it. When getting my tags made, I remember the guy asking what all I wanted on it, as you could put anything you wanted. I was very adamant about wanting all of my personal info on it, just like in the army. I still have those tags lying around somewhere, I need to find them. But it has my name, DOB, social security number, and my religious preference. I got DOB on it, instead of blood type, because we weren't aware of my type. I was only 7. I wore them for years and years. Can't tell you how many ball chains I broke or how many of those rubber rings that keep them from clanking that I went through. Anyway, yet another fragment of a long list of strange things. I'll post them in here as I recall, but I promise you there is a long list of things. Making this post is just the culmination of me experiencing more things than I can ignore.
When I was about 4 or 5, I told my parents that they weren't my first parents. I was little, and have no memory of this, but my mom and dad have both told me the story. I told them I died in a tornado in 1976, and that I had been 16. I was a weird, too smart little kid that said really strange things all the time, so my parents just chalked it up to that. About 5 years ago, my mom called me. She reminded me of the story I had told when I was little. She said it had started to bug her after all these years, so she Googled anything about tornado deaths in Michigan in 1976. There was exactly one that year. It was a 16-year-old girl, who was riding in a car when it was thrown off the road by the tornado. I looked it up too, and sure as hell she was right. I have no memory of telling them this story, and no memory of dying in a tornado. But my mom is pretty straight-laced, and not one to believe in hokey bullcrap.
Did my daughter reincarnate? So this happened some years ago when my youngest daughter was 3 years old. She was playing in the living room and my wife and I are watching TV. I notice that she is doing something that she is not supposed to, so I tell her to stop. Can't remember now what she was doing, anyways. She says, "Why?" and I give the usual parent response of, "Because I am your dad, and I said so." She stops doing the thing and goes back to playing. Then, a few minutes later she says, "You know you are not my real dad." So I think she is being cheeky, so I ask, "Oh yeah, then who is your real dad?" She looks confused for a sec, then says, "I don't remember his name, but he was my dad before I came here." At this point I am interested, so I get down on the floor. "Okay, before you were here you were in mommy's tummy," I say. She giggles and goes and snuggles into her mom. "No, it was before I was in mommy's tummy. I was waiting to come here with the other people, but before that I lived in a house with my other mommy and daddy, and I had a sister also. But not Sissy." Here she is referring to my older daughter. At this point my wife joins in. She asks, "So where did your other family live?" My wife is looking at me with a confused look. My daughter says, "We lived in a house in a city, then the fire came, and I tried to get out, but I couldn't open the door, so the smoke went in me, and I went to sleep. That when I went to wait to come here." She says this completely nonchalantly and goes back to playing. My wife and I just look at each other, totally astonished. We tried to get her to say more, but she said it was all she remembered. She has no memory of it now, but she has an intense fear of fire and smoke. I will never forget that conversation.
Do you have a creepy story? Please share it with us in the comments and we will post it on the channel. Please subscribe. Thank you.